Zapraszamy na film z szefem resortu zdrowia w aktualnej administracji waszyngtońskiej.
Hello to all my friends in Poland, to the wonderful leadership of this movement there. I'm grateful for your commitment, for your courage, and for your persistence. This is a global problem that is being pushed by a global medical cartel and global pharmaceutical companies and regulatory agencies, and our response must be global as well. And we need to now create institutions that are enduring, that are persistent, that are powerful, and that are strong enough to counter the unleashed power of this medical tyranny. I want to talk to you a little bit about the background of how we ended up with this vaccine enterprise in the United States that has essentially driven the same kind of process all across the world, and now ends up with the coup de grace of the COVID enterprise. When I was a little boy, I only had 3 vaccines, and I was fully compliant. My children today in the United States require 72 vaccines from 72 doses of 16 different vaccines in order to be able to get their constitutional right to an education. And the big change in our country occurred in 1989, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. I was born in 1954. By the mid-70s and 80s, we began to add new vaccines to the schedule. Around 1979, the government added the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine. And that vaccine turned out to be very reactogenic, meaning that it caused injuries and serious neurological injuries and deaths in about 1 out of every 300 children that received it. That vaccine is now banned in the United States. It is not used in Europe. But Bill Gates and the World Health Organization give that vaccine to 161 million African children every year. And prior to 2017, nobody had ever looked to see whether that vaccine, Bill Gates brags that vaccine saves millions of lives. Nobody had actually done the science on it to see whether that was in fact accurate. And in 2017, the Danish government decided that it was going to actually go and do the science. And they put in a lot of money, and they brought together some of the best African vaccine scientists in the world, including Morgensen and Peter Ayabi. And they did a study in Guinea-Bissau where they looked at 30 years of medical records. And what they found at the end of that study is that vaccinated girls who had received the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine, the DTP vaccine, were dying at 10 times the rate of unvaccinated children. And they concluded that the vaccine was killing more children than diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis combined. And the problem is now, nobody had seen those signals for 30 years. Everybody just assumed the vaccine was doing what it was supposed to be doing. And the vaccine was protecting children from diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, but it had ruined their immune system so that they were susceptible to diseases that had nothing to do with the vaccines, to upper respiratory infection, to pneumonia, to pulmonary diseases, to bilharzia, and to anemia and dysentery. And the girls were dying of those diseases at a much, much higher rate if they were vaccinated than if they were not unvaccinated, 10 times the rate. And so the question is, for most of us, is could that same thing be happening with all the other vaccines, but nobody's noticing it? And the answer, of course, to that is yes. And as a result of that vaccine, many people in the United States began litigating against the pharmaceutical companies, so they began suing them. And in 1986, Wyeth and the other pharmaceutical companies, Wyeth is now called Pfizer, and the other pharmaceutical companies went to the Reagan administration. And they said, we are losing $20 in downstream liabilities for every dollar that we're collecting in profits from sales of the vaccine. And if you do not give us relief, if you do not give us immunity from liability, we are going to get out of the vaccine business and we will leave the United States with no vaccine supply. And that's a national security issue. This is what they told the president. President Reagan wrote and signed, and Congress, the Democratic Congress, passed a bill which is now we call VIII, or the Vaccine Act, which gave vaccine companies complete immunity from liability in the United States. So no matter how negligent they behave, no matter how sloppy their line protocols, no matter how grievous the injury to the child, you cannot sue that company. And they told the Reagan administration that the reason that they needed this bill, because the Reagan administration said, well, why don't you just make safer vaccines? They told the Reagan administration that vaccines were unavoidably unsafe. And that rule, that word, that phrase is in the statute. It's in VIII. And VIII says because vaccines are unavoidably unsafe, we need to give them immunity from liability. So that happened in 1986, and immediately the vaccine industry, the big pharmaceutical companies, looked around, and nobody had been making money on vaccines prior to that. But afterwards, they said, holy cow, now we have a product where the biggest cost to every other medical product is gone, which is the cost of paying off the downstream injuries, the injuries that occur from that product once it's in the market. And so vaccines suddenly became enormously profitable. Vaccines have another exemption that not too many people know about, which is that they are exempt also not only from paying damages, they're also exempt from testing, from safety testing. It's the only medical product that does not need to be safety tested. And the reason for that is because it's an artifact of the CDC's legacy as the Public Health Service. The Public Health Service was the original name for CDC. And the Public Health Service was a quasi-military agency, which is why people from CDC still wear uniforms and they have military ranks like Surgeon General. One of the other artifacts, the original vaccine program was conceived as a national security defense against biological attacks on our country. So the Public Health Service wanted to make sure that if the United States was attacked by the Russians with anthrax or some other biological agent, that they could quickly formulate a vaccine and deploy it to 300 million Americans with no regulatory impediments. And they said, if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to safety test it. And that takes 5 years because you have to do randomized double-blind placebo testing and you have to look for injuries for long periods of time because medicines, oftentimes, the injuries and illnesses that are caused by medicines have long diagnostic horizons or long incubation periods and you don't see them for a long time. You have to do long 5-year studies and they didn't want to do that. So they said, we'll call it instead a biologic. And we will make biologics exempt from safety testing. And because of that, today, not one of those 72 vaccines that are now mandated for American children and are used in Poland and all over the world has ever been tested in pre-licensing safety trials against an inert placebo. And what that means is nobody knows what the true risk profile is for any of these products. And that means that nobody can tell you with a scientific certainty whether that vaccine is going to cause more injury and death in the public than it's going to avert. But there was a gold rush on CDC to add new vaccines to this schedule, and they quickly began adding lots of vaccines, many of them that had aluminum in them, many of them that had mercury, and other ingredients that had never been safety tested. And the big changing point was 1989. And you saw an explosion of new vaccines, but you also saw an explosion of chronic disease. By chronic disease, I mean really three categories of disease, beginning with SIDS, which is sudden infant death syndrome, which we didn't see before vaccination. It didn't even have a name. In the mid-'80s, they had to add it to the PDR and to the mortality and morbidity data from CDC, and they had to give it a name. They called it sudden infant death syndrome or crib death. But people before that, before vaccines, nobody had heard of a little baby who simply was perfectly healthy and died in the crib. That was the first signal that they saw. Then they started seeing other signals, and they're from three principal categories of diseases. The first is neurodevelopmental disorders. So this would be ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, sleep disorders, Tourette syndrome, narcolepsy, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and ASD, and autism. The autism rates in our country, which has the most aggressive vaccine schedule, went from 1 in every 10,000 children in my generation to 1 in every 34 children in my children's generation. And Congress said to EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, tell us what year that the changeover happened when autism exploded, and EPA came back after doing a study and said 1989. Well, that's the same year that the vaccine schedule exploded. So we saw the neurodevelopmental disorders. We also saw an explosion of allergic diseases. And we know allergic diseases are caused by vaccines, and particularly by the aluminum in vaccines. Prior to 1989, it was almost impossible to find somebody who had a peanut allergy or a food allergy. And I had 11 brothers and sisters. I had 70 first cousins, and none of them have food allergies. But my children, I have 7 children, they all have allergies. And you see them now, allergies are ubiquitous, and particularly the food allergies, or peanut allergies are ubiquitous. And it's not a surprise because they put the aluminum into vaccines as an adjuvant to heighten the immune response of the vaccine. So that your body, they put something very, very toxic, which is called an adjuvant, to get your body to give an exaggerated immune response to the vaccine adjuvant. In other words, to provoke an allergic response to that adjuvant. But the problem is that the aluminum will provoke an allergic response to anything that's in the ambient environment at that time. So if there's a peanut oil excipient in the vaccine, you now could have a lifetime allergy to peanuts. If there is a Timothy weed outbreak in the air, because you get the vaccine in the springtime, you now could have a lifetime allergy to Timothy weeds, and that's why vaccinated children have 30 times the rate of allergic rhinitis as unvaccinated children. And the last category, of course, is autoimmune diseases, which, of course, it's predictable that a vaccine which is intended to permanently alter your immune system to make it hyperactive against the antigen will also make it hyperactive against other things, including your own body. And that's what autoimmune disease is. And we saw an explosion in juvenile diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, Graves' disease, Crohn's disease, IBS, all these gastrointestinal issues, and all these other immune issues that are now ubiquitous. So in 1986, the year that the Vaccine Act was passed, 12% of American children have chronic disease. By 2006, 54% of children. And instead of making children healthier, the vaccine schedule had given us the sickest generation in the history of our country. And all of the illnesses that are part of childhood, where they're chicken pox and mumps and measles and rubella, all of those diseases are self-limiting. In other words, they leave on their own after about a week or 10 days. They are generally mild rashes, and they are all treatable. But all of the chronic diseases that are caused by vaccines, they're lifetime diseases, and none of them are curable. And if you look, there are now about 400 illnesses that have become epidemic since 1989, since we passed the vaccine schedule. And every one of those illnesses is listed on the manufacturer's inserts for those 72 vaccines as a side effect of vaccination. So that brings us today to the COVID vaccines. And by the way, the vaccine industry, when I was a little boy, was worth about $100 million. Today, it's worth $60 billion. But the real money comes not from the vaccines, but from selling all of the treatments for allergies, for ADD and ADHD, the Adderall, the Ritalin, the Concerta, the anti-seizure medication, the EpiPens, the anti-allergy medication, and the treatments for juvenile diabetes, for rheumatoid arthritis, and all these other injuries. That market is now worth about $500 billion, about $500 billion a year. So these companies are not only making money on the vaccines, but they're making the big cash on the injuries that are caused by these vaccines. And that's why we really need to be careful when it comes to the COVID vaccine. We have to understand we've given these companies immunity from liability. They have zero incentive to make these vaccines safe. Not only that, but the government and our taxpayers are paying for the vaccines to make. So the companies themselves have no skin in the game. They're not even putting investment in many cases in these. We're putting the investment. We take all the downside risk. They take all the upside benefit. And if their vaccine kills a lot of people or if it causes permanent damage, what do they care? They're going to make their money anyway. And they don't have to take any risk in bringing that product to market. Well, they have no incentive to make these vaccines safe. And let's remember, these companies are not nice people. These companies are every one of the 4 companies that makes all 72 of Americans' vaccine, Merck, Sanofi, Pfizer, and GlaxoSmithKline, they are all serial criminals, felons. In the last 10 years, those 4 companies have paid $35 billion in the United States for criminal penalties and civil damages, for lying to regulators, for defrauding, falsifying science, for defrauding the public and physicians, for blackmailing and bribing physicians, and for doing all kinds of other criminal activity. And they keep doing it again and again and again. It's part of their business model. These are the companies that gave us the opioid epidemic in our country, which is now killing 56 million American children every year. And they knew it was going to do that. They did it anyway. They have made all of this money, in fact, killing people. Vioxx, which was Merck's blockbuster drug in 2006, ended up killing between 120,000 and 500,000 Americans. from heart attacks. It was a drug that they marketed, Merck marketed it as a headache drug, knowing it was going to kill people from heart attacks. They knew that from the clinical trial, but they didn't tell anybody. Most of the people who took that drug and died would have, if they knew that there was a chance, a risk that they were going to get a heart attack, they probably would have taken an aspirin instead for their headache. But Merck didn't give them the opportunity to make that choice. Merck made them take it anyway by lying to them. It didn't give them informed consent. And that's what's going to happen with these COVID vaccines. They say they're not going to mandate them, but they are going to mandate them. They may not have a hard mandate that says we're going to kick down your door and come in and give it to you whether you like it or not. They're going to have all the soft mandates they need. And by that, I mean you're not going to be able to get on an airplane. You're not going to be able to go to a ball game. You're not going to be able to go to a bar. You're not going to be able to get your child educated unless you comply, unless you obey. And the companies have zero liability, and the regulators are not doing what they're supposed to do to assure the safety of these products. And what they're also doing, they're derailing the products that actually cure COVID, like ivermectin, which we know virtually 100% of people, if they take it prophylactically or if they take it in the onset of the disease, are going to be cured and never going to experience and never going to transmit the disease. The regulatory agencies don't want you to know about that because they are in league with the pharmaceutical companies, and they want to put us in a single funnel that will lead us directly toward vaccination. And if you've ever been to it, I know there's a lot of slaughterhouses in Poland, and you make the best kielbasa in the world. But if you see, a lot of that is local, but if you see an American slaughterhouse, they have a big corral where all the cows are, and they direct those cows down what they call a chute. And the chute gets narrow and narrower until they end up in the slaughterhouse. And that's what they're doing to us with the vaccines. They are going to direct us. They're going to make the exit smaller and smaller and smaller until all of us have to go in there. And what I'd say to you is we cannot afford to be cattle. We cannot afford to be sheep. We need to do critical thinking, and we need to stand up. We need to do democracy. And part of democracy, part of being a good citizen in a democracy, is saying no to your government when it's wrong and standing up and talking about it even when there's a price to pay. And to all my friends in Poland and to all my friends in Europe, I urge you, let's stand shoulder to shoulder, and I will be with you there on the barricades. And we need to keep our boots on and go down with our boots on if we have to, because we don't want to get into that line in the slaughterhouse and die like sheep. Let's stand up and fight. Thank you.